Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for being here tonight. I'm Nick Neely, an assistant professor of English writing at Eastern Oregon University. Welcome to the Sandra and Carl Elston Ars Poetica Fun Reading and Conversation featuring literary journalist Sierra Crane Murdoch. We're gonna wait just a minute to allow for people to come back to their seats and settle in, and then we'll get started. Thanks so much for your patience. Before we set off, this is the final event in our regular Ars Poetica reading series this academic year. However, I'm pleased to announce that we're going to have a bonus reading and chat on June 15th, just arranged, that will feature two more of the 2021 Oregon Book Award winners. Sierra Crane Murdoch is the winner this year in creative nonfiction, but we'll host Nicholas Bucala, who's the winner of in general nonfiction for The Fire is Upon Us, and Vanessa Veselka, who is the winner in fiction for a novel called The Great Offshore Grounds. Stay tuned for the link to register for that event. We'll get it to you. I'm going to put this in the chat too. Now, before we get started, I wanted to begin with a brief land acknowledgement. Since many of us are in La Grande, where EOU is located, we humbly acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land Eastern Oregon University is upon, the Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Nez Perce people. We celebrate their traditions, languages, and stories. We acknowledge their continuing connection to the land, water, and community, and pay our respects to these original stewards of Northeastern Oregon. And now it's a real pleasure to introduce you for the first time to Sierra Crane Murdoch. Sierra is going to share from her debut book, Yellowbird, Oil, Murder, and a Woman's Search for Justice in Indian Country, which, as I mentioned, just won this month the Sierra Winnemucca Award in creative nonfiction from the Oregon Book Awards. And this book was also a New York Times Book Review Best Book of the Year. Sierra's written for Harper's, This American Life, The Atlantic, The New Yorker Online, Virginia Quarterly Review, and High Country News, which is where this book, and maybe we'll talk about that. Among her other honors, she's received a Middlebury Fellowship in Environmental Journalism, an 11th Hour Food and Farming Fellowship, a visiting fellowship in an investigative reporting program at the University of California, Berkeley, and a McDowell Fellowship. Here's how she's going to introduce Yellowbird to you, but I just wanted to share what David Truer in the New York Times said of the book. He called it remarkable. The book's strength derives not from the vast panoramas, but from an intimate gaze. By looking at Casey Clark's murder on this is on a reservation in North Dakota, through Yellowbird's eyes, we get to see the forces that shape and ultimately unite their lives. I've long felt that Native communities are perceived by Native and non-Native people alike as places in America, but not of America. Murdoch troubles this false separation, helps us understand Yellowbird and Clark, and by extension, Native and non-Native lives as deeply intertwined. We also see the nervous mixture of hope and desperation, of compassion and cruelty, of money and its lack, of the desperate grasp of wealth and the human costs it exacts. Lissa Yellowbird's fanatical but dignified search brought closure to Clark's family and change to Fort Berthold. In her telling of the story, Murdoch brings the same fanaticism and dignity to the search for and meaning of modern Native America. So Sierra will read for a bit to start, and then I'll have some initial questions for her. We warmly invite your questions too at any time. Please type those into the Q&A box so we know where to find them. And thanks again to everyone for being here tonight, and over to you, Sierra.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. It's good to see you again. Yeah, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned just briefly in the book, this book began in many ways when I was an intern at High Country News. I think maybe just a year after you were there. My first cover assignment for the magazine was to go up to North Dakota and to write about the way that the Bakken oil boom was potentially going to impact the Mandan Hidatsa Rikra Nation. So I went, and then I kept going back over many years after that. And I went back for a number of reasons. One was that I began to follow the story of the rising crime on the reservation related to the boom, and particularly how the tribe had no criminal jurisdiction over non-native oil workers who were coming there mostly to work, but there was this sense among some oil workers that they could act with impunity on the reservation and get away with quite a few crimes. And it was sort of within that culture of impunity that this case I write about in the book emerged, the disappearance of Christopher Clark. Christopher Clark was white, but his case became something of an obsession of a woman named Lissa Yellowbird, who's a Rikra, who's from the reservation. And just around the same time that Clark disappeared, was emerging out of prison, having gone for drug dealing, and came home and found her reservation, her home, in this state of radical flux due to the oil boom. And so I met Lissa in 2014 as I'd come back to also write about this case. And I was immediately struck by her, and had been interested in potentially doing a longer piece about the boom, and particularly about this crime. And then through her began to sort of see this boom in a really interesting way that I hadn't seen it before. And decided and asked her if she would be interested in me telling the story of this crime kind of through her eyes and through her search for this oil worker. And then through that to sort of trace the legacy of white violence through her life story and her family. And she was game for that. And I spent the next many years immersed in her life. And this was the book that came as a result. So I'm just going to read a section. It's from actually a later chapter in the book called The Badlands. I spent many years just following Lissa into the Badlands of North Dakota on searches for Casey Clark, for the oil worker. So I'll describe that in here. There are two other characters, you could say, who are here with her. One is her son, Micah, who emerges as a really important person to her in the book. And then the other is her cousin, Waylon, who also would accompany her on these searches. So, Lissa told me that to find a body in the Badlands, I would have to know the landscape in all seasons. I should be there when the snow melted in April, and when the heavy rain in May carved rivulets into the gumbo and washed sediment into the channels that cut around the buttes. I should see the cottonwoods bud in the late spring, and in the summertime, watch the cockleburs grow thick in the coulees. The foliage would not last long, Lissa said. By late summer, the brush would turn brittle, so that a cigarette flicked out a car window might cause it to burn for days. In the fall, the rain would come again, and this too I should see, how the bentonite clay would glisten like whale skin, evening its own surface, filling the tracks of animals imprinted during the summer and fall before. The winter was also important, when the snow would bring the land into full relief, and I would notice shapes that in other seasons I had overlooked. The Badlands were never the same, Lissa said. They were always slumping, folding in on themselves. The land would reveal what it wanted to us. The point was not to force the land to give up the body, but to be there when it did. I visited Lissa regularly in the years after we met. I would fly to Fargo, where she would pick me up at the airport, and where I would spend weeks at a time tracing the paper trail of her life. That first winter and spring of 2015, I stayed with Lindsay or slept on the floor of Lissa's apartment. Then summer came, Obi moved out, and Micah repainted the spare room for me. CJ found, in the fall, Lindsay moved back in and I returned to the floor. CJ found a girlfriend who also slept on the floor a while, and Obi came home with a girlfriend too, and they shared a room with Micah. By then, I had decided the apartment was full and rented a room of my own. I accompanied Lissa to the reservation for the first time in April 2015. We met in Fargo, where I helped pack the car with tents, blankets, changes of clothes, flashlights, Coleman lanterns, Band-Aids, phone chargers, and a set of camouflage radios. We left the following morning after dawn. There was hardly room for Micah and Waylon, Lissa's cousin, who rode on a mound of Pendletons in the back. Waylon was so skinny his cheeks caved in. He had spent the recent months in jail, and Lissa thought this had done him good. His skin had color, she noted approvingly, and he was sober, praying a lot. He had spent the night before we left binding a fan of sparrowhawk feathers with a strap of leather that belonged to his late mother. Everything I have of hers I'm slowly giving away, he told me. He had gifted the fan to Lissa, who stuck it in her visor like a toll ticket. It quivered angelically above her head. The trees were budding, a green blush along the edges of the highway. Waylon tapped on a drum and now and then burst into song, Lissa murmuring the words. I would soon learn that driving to the reservation put Lissa in her best mood. She told more jokes, smoked fewer cigarettes. You'll see, she said. I think there's this nervousness, all this energy. It feels like my insides are tuning up to a higher frequency, so when I get there, I'll notice things. It'll happen to you. All these things we're driving by, they'll come into focus, and you'll think, wow, there's a million places this kid could be. She turned to Waylon. I brought some of that smudge so that we can get the evil off you, she said. Jails were full of bad spirits, and she didn't want any tagging along. Waylon nodded and pointed out the window to an embankment. Look at all those sweat rocks, cuz. Load her up. He was always collecting from the roadsides, he said. Wood, feathers, the quills of flattened porcupines. Have you ever knocked one out with a tire iron, I asked. Waylon cackled. Nah, that's funny though. Wake up and find out they've been rolled for their quills. I'll just say as an aside, one of my friends on the reservation who I mentioned earlier in the book had told me that the way that he harvests porcupine quills for his traditional wear during powwows is by knocking them out with tire irons and then making sure they wake up. No. We began by the Little Missouri River, where the bridge crossed north of Killdeer into the Badlands of Mandaree. There was a cattle guard at the entrance to the allotment and a red gate fastened with a chain. Lissa woke Micah, who opened the gate and followed us on foot to the riverbank. A dry winter had reduced the river to a trickle. We walked over sand and silt, through grass and the winter skeletons of chokecherry bushes, to where the river parted like loose strands of a braid. There, in a clearing, was a set of wooden pallets, the ground littered with bullet casings. A target had been nailed to one of the pallets and shot through a couple dozen times. Oil workers, I asked. A rig was perched on the cliff above. Yeah, probably, Lissa replied, or res kids playing around. She walked the perimeter of the clearing and then cut through the brush into a small grove. I followed and saw that she had paused. Oh, come look, she said. At the trunk of a tree were two coyotes, shot and laid like dogs in the shade. They had small wounds above their front legs, each crusted with maggots, but otherwise they might have been alive. Their coats were glossy and thick, and they lay to opposite sides, their legs extended toward the river so that the spaces between their eyes were touching. Had they arranged themselves to die this way, or had the hunter put them there, I wondered. We spent the whole afternoon like this, no pattern to our searching. Lissa seemed guided by whim, and then by instinct, and then by some mysterious calculation. She dug her boots into the ground to test its softness. She pulled up dead wood to see what was beneath. When she came to a clearing or a coulee, she paused and said, "This isn't right," or "This is the kind of a ravine I was telling you about, where the ground is easy to dig." She was always pointing to anomalies in the land. sunken patches of earth, sticks unnaturally piled so that they had to have been laid by humans. We left the riverbank and climbed a series of draws toward the cliffs where the silt became clay and the ground hardened. A creek cut around a plateau, forming a ravine into which Lissa descended. She was hardly graceful. Her feet stabbed the dirt like anvils, and she wobbled on steep terrain, but she was quick. I followed her along the creek through a mess of cattails, leaping over mud onto islands of sand. The ground was scored with the tracks of foxes, rabbits, ermine, and raccoons, and the brush along the channel was garnished with bits of fur. It struck me that Casey, if buried here, was hardly alone. To the side of the channel, beavers had built and abandoned a lodge, which had sunken into the hill like a grave. By dark, we had covered 4 or 5 miles and seen no signs of a body. I had not expected to find Casey, but I was surprised that the process soothed me, an enormous task reduced to small movements. It seemed to have a similar effect on Lissa. She was quiet on the drive that evening, pulling thoughtfully on her cigarettes. We stayed the night at the casino, where I made a bed for myself on the floor of our hotel room. Waylon and Lissa were gone most of the night, gambling their free players' cash and chatting with the guards. And when I woke in the morning, Micah was cocooned in the sheets of one bed, and Lissa was fully clothed, lying prone on the quilt of the other. Waylon had not slept at all. After we had awakened, he announced proudly that one of the guards happened to be his cousin and had hooked us up with breakfast at the casino buffet. Waylon ate 3 steaks and fell asleep in the car. Snow had fallen overnight. As we drove south along the lake through rangeland toward the Little Missouri, the sun lifted and the snow vanished. I asked Lissa if she had ever seen a dead body apart from those of friends and relatives at funerals. Yeah, she said. Briefly, in college, she had enrolled in a program to prepare for medical school, and in class, she dissected a cadaver. There was this one woman who committed suicide. She drank Drano. Can you imagine? She still had nail polish on her fingers and toes. We weren't supposed to take the shroud off their faces, but one day I couldn't stop myself. I brought sage in and wiped her down and thanked her. It was such an intimate thing, you know. I'm going to let you dig through my stomach, through my reproductive system, through my brain matter. What did you think when you saw her face? I said. I remember looking at her and thinking, why did you do that? What could be so bad in this life? You read that someone killed herself with Drano, and you think that behind that shroud, you're going to see this horrible face, twisted, eyes swollen from crying 20 years. You think it's going to be this terrible life written on a face, and then you lift it up, and it just looks normal. Lissa drove slowly, peering past me into the woods alongside the road. The trees grew thickly there, trunks tangled, buds sprouting new green. Every landmark reminded Lissa of something she wanted to tell me. Discolorations in the soil where water collected and evaporated to salt, the year-old tracks of an excavator pressed like fossils into clay, bones bleached white of various animals. If you ever need to clean a bison skull quick, just put it on a hill of fire ants, she said. Waylon and Micah had fallen quiet in the back seat. I heard Micah sigh. Oh my God, Mom, I just want a freaking flush toilet, he muttered. Lissa sat up, pinched her eyes in such a way that I knew she was thinking. Hey, Mom, said Micah. What? Why is the lake named Sakakawea? You know who that is. That wasn't my question. She helped Lewis and Clark, remember? Was she a Rikra? I think she was from further east, I said. She was kidnapped by Hidatsas. Micah stared at me, his face unexpressive. Who taught you history, he said. Then she had a baby with Lewis and Clark, added Waylon. Which one was it, asked Micah. I don't know, both, Waylon said. Lissa laughed. And that was when human trafficking all began on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. Hey, Waylon cried. I was laughing now too. Micah held his head in his hands. Lissa's cigarette jittered between her lips. We were still laughing when we turned a corner and saw a car ambling toward us. 2 men, both tribal members, the passenger holding a gun. Lissa slowed to watch the men pass. She lowered her chin, narrowed her eyes at the driver. Mom, the toilet, Micah said. Our time together was often like this. Lissa would say something that made us laugh so hard our bellies hurt, and then she would go quiet, reproachful, as if we had stumbled into danger. Driving with Lissa on the reservation made me feel electrified. Her moods shifted wildly. I rarely knew where we were going or why we went the places we did. If I asked, Lissa often would not tell me. She would act as if I should have known or as if she had said it already. I started asking fewer questions. I stared out the window, answered her demands. Find my lighter, she would say, or do I have any more cigarettes? And I would go rooting through the console, through instant coffee and pill bottles and phone chargers and sage until I found what she was looking for. With anyone else, I would have felt annoyed, but with Lissa, I felt like a wingman. She made every task seem important, as if we were on some covert mission, which in a sense we were.
Thank you so much, Sierra. That's lovely. You know, I'm glad you read from this section because it really, I think, puts us in a place at the reservation, gives us a feel for it on the ground. And you know, I was really mystified, or the fact that Lissa Yellowbird spends time searching for the body of Christopher Clark on the reservation really spoke to the extent of her obsession. Or even as a reader, you're thinking, you know, sheer delusion that she could find what she herself describes as a needle in a vast haystack. But this passage really makes it so clear that it's sort of a practice for her, and has a calming effect, and is also a way to be reconnected to a homeland when she's left behind. I wondered if you could, you know, if we could step back and just talk about when you knew this was going to be a book. And you mentioned that briefly in your introduction, but you happen across this incredible character, Lissa Yellowbird, who's an incredible sleuth. I mean, she's an investigator, completely obsessed with this case. And was it in that first meeting that like a switch flips? Did you already know, in essence, that you were going to write a book about the oil boom on the reservation? Or was it later when you visited her in Fargo and you're scrolling through her incredible trove of documentation and all her investigation, her files? When was it that you things that just clicked for you and you said, you know, I need to talk to her about doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I had kind of had it in the back of my mind ever since I started going to the Bakken oil fields that maybe I would want to write a book eventually about this oil boom. The reason was that I had moved out west from Appalachia, from coal country. And so, and I lived in coal country kind of at the very end of the boom and bust cycle, where they were just finally just blowing up mountains to like scrape up the last of the coal. And so when I got to North Dakota, I was just struck by the fact that I was very much observing the beginnings of that cycle. And so I was interested in maybe coming back like 50 years later when the oil was running out, or, you know, when the boom really went bust. The bust really happened sooner than anyone expected. But, you know, the reason why I understood that like seeing the boom on the reservation through my eyes was actually not particularly interesting, or maybe not interesting enough for a book. And it's not my home. It's not a place I've observed over a long period of time. And so I didn't feel capable of doing that. But when I met Lissa, you know, this was someone who had like both an insider and an outsider perspective. An insider because she was from this place, her family was from that place, she understood the history of exploitation of the reservation. And at the same time, she was an outsider because she had been sort of removed from her community for a fairly long period of time through her addiction and through going to prison through crimes resulting from that addiction. So so she was returning with fresh eyes, and I found that dichotomy to be just really compelling. I do think she saw the transformation of her home in this very clear way that maybe other members of her family didn't quite see. So I was compelled by that instantly when I met her. I also was compelled by her just as a person. You know, I knew instantly that she was brilliant and that she was fascinating, and she was very iconoclastic. You know, she had experiences that were perhaps representative of women and mothers and people who've been addicted, and you know, indigenous women, and you know, so her story was in some ways representative, but in some ways just totally unusual. You couldn't fit her in a box, and so that duality was also very compelling to me. But you're right, it wasn't really until she invited me to Fargo, and you know, she was working as a welder at the time, and I was staying in her apartment, and she would just like leave at, you know, 4:30 a.m. and then turn on her computer before she left, and then just let me all day long just sift through her hard drive, which was an incredible amount of trust, and download whatever I wanted. And so I would sift through, and I would read these text messages that she had saved over the course of many years, in which she had kind of like infiltrated the lives of these people she believed were responsible for Casey's disappearance. I mean, it was incredible. I began to realize through reading them that she potentially had been very responsible for breaking open the case in these sort of unusual ways. And then not only that, but, you know, during the day, I would be reading these conversations. And then, you know, in the evening, Lissa would come home and we would talk over dinner about different things that had happened. And she would often just like recite dialogue, like conversations she had had, and I had just like read those conversations that day, you know, in these text messages. So she also just had almost like a photographic memory for many of the conversations that had transpired. And you know, between the documentation and her memory, it was like a journalist's dream to have this story in such detail. And so, you know, that was when I realized that there was potentially enough material for the book, and that's when I began to for a book, and that's when I began to you know, ask her about her interest in that.
Yeah, she's an absolutely incredible character, and she's hard to figure out. You know, she's hard to pin down as you're reading. She does things that are completely unexpected, and it seems like what's makes her a effective detective, as it were. She kind of and I wondered how, you know, it occurred to me in reading the book that she's completely obsessive character. She falls asleep, you know, at the computer working on trying to crack open this case, or make things happen towards finding Christopher Clark. And then, so she's an investigator, and you yourself as a reporter are an investigator, but you have different methods, a different code of ethics. We see Lissa doing things like lying, manipulating interactions with people to try to create so that people will reveal themselves, or so that she'll get somewhere in her investigation. And I wondered whether you thought about your sort of parallel obsessions, and how her obsession, you know, made you think about your own. I mean, you talk about in this book, you spent over 1,000 hours, that's right, maybe more.
You just cut out.
And then did over 200. Oh, sorry. You did over 1,000 hours. You spent over 1,000 hours with Lissa and did 200 interviews, and you know, visited all the peripheral sites to this story. An incredible amount of work. So if you could just speak to, you know, how you were thinking about her investigation and yours that followed, and what you made of it.
Yeah. You know, I opened the book with this question of like, what is it that drove Lissa to search for Casey Clark? Like, what sort of, yeah, why is she upset? Why does she become so obsessive in this way? And it's a question I kind of struggle to answer throughout the course of the book, but make various attempts at. And at one point, you know, and this was something I thought about a lot. At one point, I sort of wonder aloud in the book, you know, that that maybe sort of the curiosity she has about people's lives is the same curiosity that I have about her life. You know, she's like very much kind of like immersing herself in the stories of these people and trying to understand those stories in as much detail as she can gather and understand their relationships, understand their motivations. And, you know, those were all things I was asking of Lissa, and becoming very obsessed with her life as well. And so, but yeah, you said there's this difference, right? She's like, she has this very clear goal of trying to find like a particular answer, and she is manipulating and creating aliases and you know, sort of tricking people into telling her things. You know, that's not something morally I could do as a journalist. And it's not something, you know, that is good practice as a journalist. You want the people that you're working with to genuinely trust you. But you know, I guess the difference there, right, is that she was trying to sort of, you know, she was working for what she saw as justice, and justice for Casey, justice for missing people, justice for her community on the reservation, for her tribe, feeling that, you know, this case was very closely linked to the corruption and the exploitation that she had seen take place, not only during the oil boom, but in sort of generations before. And so, yeah, so she was driven by a sense of justice, and I was compelled by that as well. I was compelled by her vision of justice, and just how like just how committed, the fact that she could be so committed to that sense of justice that she could then pursue it in like somewhat amoral ways, right? And it made her very complicated, and it was that complication and also her honesty around her complication and around her flaws and around mistakes she had made or things that she had done that had been hurtful to other people in the past. It was that made her so compelling to me. You know, she was someone who could see herself like very clearly, and you know, that was also a remarkable gift to have as a writer, to be allowed into someone's life that deeply.
Yeah, I mean, she shared everything with you. It seems like everything on her computer, from her Facebook, her moves on Facebook, to her text messages. You quote from her journals, her personal journals at time, and it really just shows layers of her activity and her reflection over the book. On the subject of, I mean, I had not read a book that foregrounded Facebook communications and the way that the mother of the missing person created a sort of Facebook page to funnel tips to it, and she spends just an enormous and obsessive amount of time on this page interacting with other users. And then but I wondered, you know, and also the text messages that are just incredible dialogue. And you know, what was your thinking about sort of using those kind of new records, using Facebook posts and communications on Facebook, and some of the ethical considerations there? I mean, there's disinformation involved that she herself is intentionally putting forward, and it certainly adds to the mystery, right, of the story, because we're trying to figure out, alongside Lissa and Jill, Casey's mother, you know, what's true. But what, you know, was that just a totally weird experience? Did you anticipate spending as much time with Facebook and text messaging?
No, I mean, I have like a complete aversion to the internet. I try to use it as little as possible. I turn it off during the day when I'm trying to write. No, and I use social media mainly for work, like some personal reasons. But no, I absolutely, like, my Facebook account exists for the purpose of like this book. Yeah, I mean, so that's one side of things. You also mentioned like, the ethical well, I'll also say kind of in a literary sense, like there is something that sort of like turns me off. I think because do have this like aversion to just the sort of barrage of information and data that comes from like being engaged with the internet on a daily basis. I think, I had sort of this like resistance to it in writing about it. And yet it really was sort of the basis of my chronology and the basis of many of the sort of like internal dramas that unfolded in the book. And so it was essential for building that story and building some amount of suspense. So yeah, I came around to the fact that I was like sort of blessed with that trove of communication. But then in terms of the ethical considerations, I mean, this is something I had to think about both ethically and legally. So for example, there's one person in the book, Sarah Creveling, who's the husband of the man Lissa believes is very much responsible for Casey's disappearance. And she wonders even if Sarah is involved. And so Sarah was someone who was being investigated and who was implicated in several different ways. And so, she's someone whose messages I use extensively throughout the book, partially because they didn't become part of the public legal record, but they were sort of used legally and also sort of contributed to an understanding of how guilty or not guilty she may have been. So that's one thing. On the other hand, there were a number of very personal communications Lissa had with other people where I lightly quote them from the book, but I mainly paraphrase them because I had less of a legal justification for using them. And there are all kinds of laws that I had to go through with like Random House lawyers around, like for epistolary work, for example, like if you're quoting letters, you can only use like 5% of the correspondence you have if you don't have like express permission from that person. And nonfiction writers have gotten in trouble in the past with like writing biographical work where they rely on people's letters. So that was something we had to consider. And then we had to consider, okay, is like are we talking 5% of this text message or 5% of the conversation they had that day, or like, so it got very complicated, but it was something we had to talk about.
I'm wondering, did you have an idea of those complications as you were reporting or in the early stages of writing, or was it really once you submitted the manuscript and you were talking with the lawyers were looking it over? And
I was thinking ethically about it earlier on, like what, for example, Casey's mother was not interested in participating in the book, even though I did meet her. And so, I thought, okay, like how much do I need to put in to make her part of to make the story truthful, and how much can I leave out to sort of respect her privacy? So, a lot of personal information I did not, add into the book for that reason. But then, it wasn't really until I talked to the lawyers that I learned the whole like 5% rule, and as we sort of like got into the nuts and bolts of how much I actually had to use, and I did end up cutting down that correspondence quite a bit, but it also, was helpful for the flow of the book. Too much of that would have been overwhelming.
What the remarkable thing about those, as an aside, those text messages is that they read as dialogue, but they're not dialogue in that they're very crafted and they're dramatic in a way that they don't read that way because it sounds like speech, but there's this big pause potentially between them and they're very calculated. So it's kind of a fascinating experience for a reader to sort through those and try to figure out the motivations behind those texts. To go back to the way you foreground Lissa and it's really her story, and it's a book-length profile of her and her complex and often troubled past, real moments of total darkness. And
Mhm.
which it's hard to even summarize all the things she's been through. And so you start. I thought about the way you started with her. A more conventional approach for a true crime
Mhm.
book might have been like start with a bit of the crime, and you didn't go that route, and that felt like philosophically really sound to me. And then even you didn't go to the crime next. Then you went to the history of the tribes and their sort of long history of displacement. And those are more than the crime itself, are sort of like the main threads that I see entwining over the course of this book. And I wonder if you could just speak to, they resonate with each other. And we think about the idea, which you bring up in your author's note, directly, the idea of generational trauma and the way that what we can see in this over a century of trauma might be manifesting in some intangible way or inspecific way in Lissa's life. And so how did you negotiate, putting up that, like creating that parallel, but not making too much of it? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I wrote a first draft of the book, which was a total mess. And then I went back and I spent a lot of time thinking about the structure of this book and realized, sort of as you kind of identified, that there are like three major parts, right? There is the story of Lissa. There's the story of the oil boom. And in that, sort of the backstory of the reservation, and then there's the story of this crime. And I thought of those three as being sort of interwoven throughout, but Lissa being the dominant thread that sort of helped tie all those pieces together. And through her history, through her story, like one of the reasons why I found her so compelling as like a protagonist for the story is because she understood sort of her place in that story, and she also understood the crime as sort of like the culmination of this legacy of white violence, beginning with like her family being continually displaced, and I write about the oil boom being like one layer in many layers of historical trauma that this community has experienced, and the layer prior to the boom being the flooding of most of the reservation. Like 90% of the reservation was flooded out in 1953 after the US government built a series of dams on the Missouri River, part of the Pick-Sloan Plan. And the MHA Nation was just one of many tribes that were impacted, but the MHA Nation was significantly impacted. They were largely self-sufficient, had very little unemployment prior to that. And then after that flooding, were forced to move to higher ground and had like an 80% unemployment rate after that. And that was what sort of like forced their dependence on federal funds in a way that they'd never been dependent before. And then also kind of led up to this moment, right, in the boom when they were uniquely vulnerable, in need of money, wanting some degree of independence or to reclaim some independence that they had had before. And so, leaders within the tribe saw the boom as potentially this opportunity to get there. But then, the force of the boom kind of took over and it became out of their control. So, does that answer your question? Does that answer it?
No, it
Okay.
doesn't in many ways. In thinking about the way that the displacement, right, with the flooding and the creation of the reservoir, you write about how that sent many members of the nation to other places, right? There was a dispersion that occurred at that point, and a kind of fracturing a little bit of the community. And Lissa sort of represents that in a way, though her mother was very accomplished as a professor. She had gone to Los Angeles, and so she was, as you say, an outsider. Anyways, and another. Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, that's great. I actually, yeah, that's a great parallel. Like her mother was coming back after
Yeah.
after the flood as well, and sort of seeing her community anew. So there are many, yeah, many layers of that sort of like seeing their community's transformation with fresh eyes.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing that just really strikes you is, and you do a great job bringing out, is the irony of the boom, right?
Mhm.
Which I think you write that the tribe, the nation, made more than $1 billion over, a short period of time on royalties. Is that right?
Yeah.
And yet there are all these cascading, side effects of drug addiction, money being misused, corruption that really, in some ways, set the tribe back. And had you seen that from afar, or to what extent, how long were you there reporting on the ground before that became super clear to you?
I would say it didn't totally become clear to me until about 2015, and by that point, I'd been going to the reservation for about 4 years. I mean, what made that clear to me was the fact that in 2012 and 2013, I spent a lot of time riding along with tribal police
Mhm.
officers for a different story, and they were starting to tell me just like the amount of drugs that they were seeing suddenly come into the reservation. And to be honest, the reservation did not have much of a meth or heroin problem prior to the oil boom. Certainly because of like this long history of trauma, there was a lot of there certainly was a lot of alcoholism, but you just suddenly we're seeing this influx in drugs, and it was dealers being opportunistic and seeing a bunch of people who were vulnerable with a lot of money,
Yeah.
um, who could buy all that product, and so you just had these addiction rates skyrocketing, and I saw the beginning of that, but it really wasn't until years later, after I kept coming back, and honestly that people that I had interviewed, police officers I knew, that I saw people who I had known for a long time falling into these addictions, and in some cases dying. And so um, yeah, that's not something I go in very deeply in the book. I see that transformation more through Lissa's eyes and through her family's eyes. But it was something that I personally observed as well, just among the people that I knew.
Speaking of writing along and spending time, in the boom,
Mm.
what was the experience of reporting? And maybe this is a cliched question, but in a largely a men's world of the oil fields, what was that like? And simultaneously, you're a white reporter in a Native community, and in particular embedded in Lissa's family.
Mhm.
And you write, towards to the latter, you speak about that really, or you write about that really eloquently in your author's note, but you don't really comment on what you encountered as a woman reporting in
Mhm.
and among the men's camps of the boom. I'd be curious to hear what that was like. How you
Yeah,
encountered.
I mean, I didn't go into man camps by myself. I didn't go into bars by myself. I, you know, I was pretty safe in terms of like in terms of sort of where I went and who I spoke with. A lot of the interviewing I did was mainly among tribal members, and I felt very safe in those cases. In you know I interviewed a lot of oil workers about their experiences in the boom, but many of those oil workers I interviewed were people who I reached out to specifically because they played a major role in the book
Okay.
story. And so I came to see the boom more through the eyes of the people who were, yeah, like intimately involved. And so I kind of like I wasn't just sort of like randomly wandering around. There are some scenes in the beginning of the book when I kind of just like come across some oil workers in a parking lot of the casino, and they tell me that like how easy it is to get away with things on the reservation.
Mhm.
And so I had a few interactions like that, but for the most part, I felt safe. I do think there's like some amount of hubris you have when you're in your early 20s and you're just like wandering about the world. And I'm sure there are things I did then that I probably would not do now. And I also will say that, a lot of my reporting on this book was with Lissa. And a lot of the more, risky things I did were with Lissa. And I write at some point that, I felt like she sort of infected me with her sense of invincibility, but that she did not have the same confidence in me that I had in her. And so she was constantly telling me to sort of be on the lookout and to be more aware. And, so yeah, I don't know. I always feel, I do get that question and I feel like I have a somewhat unsatisfying answer to it because I didn't actually feel that at risk myself. But
we're glad.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, this, the reader just can't believe the kind of risks that Lissa's taking, knowing the bad actors who are she's communicating with potentially, right? And you almost feel that she's lucky, that she wasn't targeted, and she was in ways that are a little ambiguous. I'd be curious, and also I wanted to say to the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them in our remaining time. I've got more, but I'm sure yours are probably better. Do you have any tips for the literary journalists or the writer in general about how to? You reveal early on in the opening pages that this case had almost had been resolved more or less by the time you started looking into it. And yet the book is so suspenseful. And so my basic question is, do you have any tips for how to create suspense over the arc of a book? Tricks that you found yourself returning to, not that they're tricks if they're done right. Or maybe that's not true. But any tips?
Wow, that is a good question. I have to say, and this kind of relates to a question you asked earlier about it being a true crime versus having all these other elements of the boom and the story. And when I set out to write this book, I would begin to tell people what it was about, and they'd say, "Oh, a true crime? I love true crime." And I am embarrassed to admit, I honestly didn't even realize that this genre was like a big thing. And that people were so obsessed with it. I'd listened to Serial, but that was pretty much my experience with the genre of true crime. So it was not, I found murder stories to be kind of scary. It was not, something I sought out, or it wasn't a genre I read a lot myself. And so I felt this, sort of a setback in understanding how to even structure a suspenseful narrative. I do have experience in stories that don't have a bunch of natural suspense, trying to build that suspense, so I could draw on that. When I set out to write this book, I felt like this profusion of plot. And there was so much more that didn't go into the book, and I just was constantly frustrated. I'm like, gosh, there's all this plot, there's all this mystery. What do I where do I find space for character development? Where do I find space for landscape description? Where do I find space for history and sort of political context? All these things, all these elements that were the reason why I'd come to this story in the first place. But when it came to the mystery narrative, it really just was a matter of carpentry. It just was getting all the elements of the story down, and then just revising over and over and over again, and making sure that I was shortening and lengthening sections and scenes to build that sort of rhythmic and tonal suspense. And again, that's probably an unsatisfying answer. It's just more drafts. But it just took many tries of figuring it out. And I didn't necessarily come across any tricks of the trade. It just was a matter of putting stuff on paper and seeing what worked. So
You make a great point, though, that, you know, when you try to create suspense with something that's not naturally suspenseful, then when you have a really actually gripping story, you know, it carries itself to some
yeah,
degree.
yeah.
We've got a question here from an anonymous attendee. What are your top 3 favorite books? Any recommendations? Any recommended books for literary journalists or those who want to get into literary journalism?
Oh man, top 3. I'm terrible at favorites because I feel bad about leaving out writers who I just love. I mean, I'll first say that there are books that, you know, certainly I read to sort of like draw on their tradition. You know, a lot of literary nonfiction that I felt inspired by is different from the book I wrote, you know, because I chose to bring myself into the story, and a lot of the literary nonfiction I sort of admired and kind of like worked in the tradition of for a while was written in the third person. So I'm thinking of you know, Catherine Boo's Behind the Beautiful Forevers. I'm thinking of Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc's Random Family. Actually, Anne Fadiman's The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down. She does write that in the first person, so that was more similar. So those are some like you know, literary nonfiction books that I consider now kind of like classics that I drew from. I personally read you know, one of my literary heroes, Barry Lopez, who just passed away this winter. I read a lot of fiction, actually. And I read fiction because it helps me understand how to like sort of create give life on the page to these people who are very very alive to me, you know, when I meet them. And so like how do you build character, how do you build scene. So and I read a lot of Native writers as I was working on this book. The poet Natalie Diaz. I read Joy Harjo's Crazy Brave. I read Louise Erdrich's novels because they're honestly the only books that are set in the same area and have many of the same people who felt so similar to the people that I was spending my days with. So yeah, those are just some recommendations.
That's a great summer list. Everyone write those down. I think we have time for one last question or two. Here's one from Christopher. Can you speak to the initial conversation with Lissa about writing the book? I mean, approaching her to write the book. Did you feel any resistance from the community more generally throughout the reporting or writing process?
Yeah, so I write in the author's note that Lissa and I remember a little differently how the book began. We tell just slightly different stories. I remember sitting in her kitchen in Fargo and saying, okay, I know I came to you thinking I was going to write a magazine story about this case, but how would you feel if I wrote a book and I made the book about you? And I remember in that moment, her just being very quiet and then just kind of changing the subject, which is something that Lissa does when she's like thinking about something. So I knew that she wasn't giving me an answer quite yet. She remembers me like traipsing through the Badlands, chasing after her, trying to keep up with her, and then saying this to her. And she says she like turned around and she said, "I'll think about it." So in any case, you know, what I do know is that that was a question that kind of like grew over time, and our trust grew over time. And you know, I did ask her at one point, you know, like, why did you trust me to do this? Why did you ultimately decide we could do this? And she says, well, you know, you just kind of showed up and then you kept coming back. And there is a point, years into spending time with Lissa, when I realized, and she said this to me, she said, a lot of people come into my life and then they just disappear and I don't see them again. And I knew at that point that our relationship was important to her, as it was very important to me, not just for the purpose of writing the book. We spent a lot of time together at that point. And I think when you immerse yourself that deeply in someone's life and they reveal themselves to you that much, it's hard not to feel like a deep sense of intimacy with that person. And so, I thought, okay, I don't want to be one of the people, I don't want to be of someone who just like sort of comes into her life to write this book and then leaves. And so, we are still very much a part of each other's lives. And that was an important thing for me. Yeah. Nick, I think you're frozen. That was a good moment. The end, I guess. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A before Nick comes back. So what else am I curious about currently? So I am starting to work on another book that has emerged out of the time that I've spent in the past 10 years, like writing largely about tribal communities, which is not something I ever expected to do. But I, in the way that sort of I found that writing about Lissa and sort of engaging in her life made me see myself more clearly, I think, to living and working on the edge of Native and non-Native communities has definitely made me see whiteness more clearly, and particularly white guilt more clearly. So that's sort of the vague topic that I'm digging into now as I begin to think about my next project. And Susan asked, how many drafts do you think you've written? That is a very hard question to answer. I'm not totally sure. I mean, I would say that I wrote like 4 completely different drafts of the book. And then in between then I would also, I would revise a lot as I went along. Writing a book was really challenging for me in a lot of ways because I am a perfectionist when I write shorter pieces. I'm someone who has to, like make each line perfect before I move on to the next. And it's not a style that I recommend. But I also, when I wrote the book, I realized that almost every sentence I wrote in the first draft was probably going to change. And so I had to become really good at writing what writers call shitty first drafts. And managed to sort of come into that and realize the importance of that. Nick, are you back? Hello?
Hello? Is anyone still there?
Yeah.
We had disastrous technological moment. I can't see you, but can you see me?
I cannot see you, but there's a nice N on your screen, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's after 8 o'clock. We had a good conversation before things went awry there. I just want to thank you, Sierra, so much for sharing about the book, and there's lots more to talk about, but we'll have to do it on occasion. And thanks to Evan Humphrey doing the tech in the background this whole series. And thanks to everyone for attending and for bearing with us, especially at this last moment. Sierra, thanks again.
Yeah.
So nice to have you here.
Thank you. This was great. This was really fun. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, Nick, for hosting.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Take care.